Leviticus 5, let's call this one restoration, specifically with regard to the guilt offering, because that's primarily what is handled in this chapter, which really is a discussion that goes over into chapter 6 as well. So we'll probably include some of that too. But basically seems to break down into three components. One, it's an issue of uncleanness. Most of these are dealing with either ceremonial uncleanness by touching something that is off limits, whether it's a bodily discharge or just a dead animal, or something else that would make a person unclean in the congregation. But it's also going back to that concept we talked about in the last chapter about integrity and the ways that a lack of integrity can make us unclean. So let's just start off in verse 1 of chapter 5, where it reads, "If anyone sins in that he hears a public adjuration to testify, and though he is a witness, whether he has seen or come to know the matter, yet does not speak, he shall bear his iniquity." And then it'll go in verse 2, "Or if anyone touches an unclean thing," so on and so forth. And the first thing to understand is that as opposed to the last chapter where all of these were unintentional sins, some of these seem to be a mix where it's over and over again going to use this phrase, "and he realizes his guilt," in verse 2, and he realizes his guilt in verse 3, and he realizes his guilt in verse 4, and he realizes his guilt in verse 5. And understand that realizing guilt isn't the same necessarily as doing something unintentionally, because later on in chapter 6 especially, it's going to get into sins of fraud or a misused trust, similar to some things we saw back in Exodus 22. And a lot of these aren't going to really sound like unintentional sins when you look at chapter 6, verse 1, where it says, "The Lord spoke to Moses saying, if anyone sins and commits a breach of faith against the Lord by deceiving his neighbor in a matter of deposit or security, or through robbery, or if he has oppressed his neighbor or has found something lost and lied about it, swearing falsely, in any of all the things that people do and sin thereby." And we'll go on to talk about the way in which you atone for that. And all of these, likewise, since this is a sacrificial system, are going to involve a sacrifice to God. But one of the things that seems to distinguish these guilt offerings has to do with the fact that you not only have to make it right with the sacrifice to God, you got to restore what you did wrong to your brother. Going back to chapter 5. Let's look at verse 16. "He shall also make restitution for what he has done amiss in the holy thing and add a fifth to it." Likewise, verse 4 of chapter 6, "If he has sinned and has realized his guilt, he will restore what he took by robbery or what he got by oppression, or the deposit that was committed to him, the lost thing that he found, or anything about which he has sworn falsely. He shall restore it in full and shall add a fifth to it." And so with that, these seem to be the situations where his realization of his guilt is before he simply consumed the thing. Because if you look back to Exodus 22, it's going to talk about a person who is either caught in the act of stealing, that person can actually be killed, or an individual who has either destroyed or sold the thing that they stole. The penalties are much more severe. If it's an ox, 5 ox for an ox, or 5 oxen for an ox. If it's a goat, 4 goats for a goat, and then double, so on and so forth. But this is simply restoration plus a fifth. This seems to be suggesting, this is just me guessing, but it seems to be a situation where a person, not necessarily realizing that they did wrong, since a lot of this is theft and fraud and so forth, and refusing to testify. A lot of it is a person realizing their guilt before they've gotten rid of the thing that will allow them to make restitution. And so if you're in a position where you can make restitution, this is me once again guessing, this is a provision where you add a fifth to make things whole. And why is that so important? Well, ultimately, when I looked at the Bible Project, they helped heavily influence my perspective on this in making that lateral compensation, not just a sacrifice to God. They talked about the ways in which sin can proliferate a community through destroying the trust in that community if the lateral relationships are not properly restored. And this goes back to what we saw in the righteousness of people like Jacob trying to restore his relationship with Esau, Joseph's brothers trying to restore their relationship with him. And likewise, when I was overseas, when we had incidents where we had to call the police, one of the cool things was seeing the police come right out and actually hold court in the community, understanding that I could win the case and persuade them that I could get my way, but still lose out if the community didn't trust me. So they would settle it right then and there so the community could have peace. And in many ways, that's what the guilt offering is doing. It's restoring peace to the community.